Good morning, beloved Berkeley Covenant Church family. I miss you all so much. I miss our face-to-face interactions and our conversations and going deeper with you in person in so many other ways. As many of you know, this Sunday, April 19th, we were going to resume our discussion on sexuality. And this was after our break for Berkeley High School and other spring breaks. A lot of people were traveling and Holy Week, and so we had a planned break until April 19th. But here we are. Here we are in shelter in place. And the more that I've thought about this and talked with folks, it seemed clear that 45 committed individuals, which would equal 45 faces plus my own, on Zoom would not be an ideal format for sharing, for working through our questions, for discerning on issues of sexuality. And thus, we have to take a different course. As Proverbs 16:9 says, we can make our plans, but the Lord will determine our steps. So I began working on a plan B for this season, as I have been discerning where God is presently discerning our steps, what we need to be talking about, the questions I'm hearing, resources that we can provide to each other. And so for a season, we're going to talk about where is God in the COVID-19 pandemic as our plan B for Christian education and formation in this current season. Please forgive me as I'm using PowerPoint to record this, and every time I get to the end of a slide, it cuts out and cuts back in, so I'm going to pause. Doesn't mean everything's over, but we're just moving on to the next slide. I still haven't figured out a way to do this with my presentation and to film it at the same time, so I opted for the presentation format, and I hope this works okay. So in this class, we will look at lots of questions we've been asking, questions about God, questions about the coronavirus in particular. Where do viruses come from? What's the evolutionary history of viruses? Does God create viruses? Where does COVID-19 in particular come from? Are viruses evil? Is there a way we can really talk about viruses as a sort of evil that God never intended for? If so, why does God allow them at all? These are all questions we'll be talking about in this course. We'll also be talking about questions that have been emerging in many formats, including folks honestly asking me at Berkeley Covenant Church, does this have anything to do with Revelation? And at first I was kind of a skeptic on this. Not that I'm convinced at this point that it is the end of days, but as I started looking again, even watching my own course on Revelation that I gave not too long ago, and happening upon the beginning of the end, I saw this verse. I looked and saw a white horse, and its rider had a bow, and he was given a crown. And if we look at the Latin word for crown is corona, which is intriguing to say the least. And a bow is a symbol of epidemic, of pandemic. This is a symbol of plague in the ancient world. And so we have some sort of corona plague, some sort of corona pandemic as the first sign of the end. And I find that interesting. But it makes me ask other questions, such as, well, what if it were the beginning of the end? If Christ were coming back, if the world was in this point of decision, how should I live as a Christian? What should I be doing? How should I be, what should I be focusing on? There's great hope in this, but there's also great accountability. So these are some real questions, and in a deeper way, maybe beyond this, we could say, this really is the beginning of the end of the world as we know it. That when we emerge from this, we are going to emerge into a different world, a world that has changed as a result of this pandemic. Whether or not this is God's plan for the end of days, or whether this is something else, it is really the end of the world as we have known it. In the same way, September 11th was the end of one world and the beginning of another. And now we're going to be living in a post-pandemic world. So this is some stuff that needs processing. We'll talk about God's kosher laws. There's some interesting wisdom here. Leviticus 11:19, which talks about certain things being forbidden to eat. Among them, some animals such as bats. Eating bats is something that God says we shouldn't do. And interestingly, the COVID virus started with eating animals, snakes and bats that shouldn't be eaten. So there's some interesting wisdom to think about here. What's the role of God's laws with global pandemics? But what we will really be focusing on is how God answers out of the storm. Many of us today feel like we are in a storm that may last for many months. If you look at the estimates, this could be a long time that we're in this. Carol Kuhl recently sent me a helpful article that talks about this pandemic as a blizzard that could last for 18 months or more. So it's like preparing for a blizzard to be shut in. And what will life look like in an 18-month or more blizzard? And we feel like we're in a storm. And how does God answer out of that storm? Well, when Job is suffering and asks God, why this suffering? God answers him and doesn't simply come alongside him as a silent comforter, right? What I was really struck by this time reading through Job is that God gives actual answers. They're not simple answers. God's response is neither simple nor straightforward. They're complex answers. They require a lot of reflection, a lot of discernment, a lot of thinking. Well, why is God saying what God is saying? God, first of all, warns against those who darken counsel from ignorance. So we don't want to be ignorant. We want to be knowledgeable about what we're talking about. That's part of the challenge of answering these questions, is not answering from ignorance and making the problem worse. And God gives ecological and evolutionary reasons that require much depth of knowledge and understanding. So we're going to explore some of God's reasons and why, right? What is our role as the church in speaking God's truth to others when they ask us, why is God allowing this? Why is God permitting this virus? Many of me as family and friends have asked me this question, and so I wanted to create a resource, not just for me, but for all of us, to think about these questions together. The way we can begin this is to talk about God's perspective. This is the only way to make sense of reality and to see things from God's perspective is the only way to make sense of the present suffering. We get God's perspective from Scripture. We get God's perspective in Job. He says, look at the foundations of the world. This is part of the answer. Were you there when I laid the foundations? There's something about the foundations of the world that is here. And so nature and Scripture give us some answers. So we can talk about how does this current epidemic, how does this current pandemic relate to the question of how is the world founded? How did God create the world? God's ways are discovered through both nature and Scripture in a deep study of both of these, but God's ways are not our ways, and God's thoughts are not our thoughts. And we need to be willing to transcend ourselves, to go deeper into the will, into the mind of God to understand this, so we can be a source of light and a source of truth and not darken counsel, as so many are reaching out to God in this moment. This is a moment to shine, church. This is a moment to be the light and reflect the light of God into a world that is suffering through so much darkness of counsel, darkness of uncertainty, darkness of fear. Let's give them faith, church. And I hope and pray that this class will be a resource in helping foster faith in a world that is so full of fear. The format will be, I will post a longer version. This is the mini teaser class, and I will post a full version where we get deeper into discussion on, it's already posted on this link if you're interested. Watch the presentation. And then what I'm going to do is I have some discussion questions at the end of the presentation. Look at those, think about them. If you want to write some things down, and then I'm going to host a Zoom meeting. For anyone who wants to join us, the date and time will be announced. I'll see, if you want to send me an email, if you absolutely want to make it to this discussion, and you tell me the times that don't work, and I'll try to figure something out. I'm thinking at this point, maybe a Sunday afternoon. Let me know if, that seems to be a time when we're not at work, at least. Maybe after lunch, maybe we can have lunch together. But I would love if you would join us as we talk about these discussion questions. I don't know how long this series will be. Maybe it'll be an 18-month series, or maybe God will guide our steps in a different direction. But God be with you. I love you all. God bless you and keep you and guide you in this time. May He guide you into faith rather than fear until we meet again.